Joe really setting the stage for making his son the boss? The brewing dissension now gave Joe's bitter cousin Stefano Magaddino the opportunity he had been waiting for. The Buffalo crime boss instigated a rebellion by one of Joe's longtime captains, Gaspar di Gregorio. Gaspar had been the best man at Joe's wedding and was the godfather of son Bill. The commission, now operating without Joe Bonanno, supported the uprising. The tension mounted when a rumor spread in New York that Joe Bonanno was planning to eliminate his adversaries by assassinating 3 of his fellow godfathers. The commission demanded that Joe come forward and explain himself. Fearing a trap, Joe refused. He denied the story, claiming that Magaddino had concocted the tale in order to destroy him.
All of the problems that developed between Bonanno's and the so-called commission could be laid directly at the doorstep of Steve Magaddino. We caused our own downfall in that respect because it caused dissension among ourselves.
By the fall of 1964, both the commission and a federal grand jury wanted answers from Bonanno. The godfather was being squeezed by the mob and the law. Then he disappeared. On October 20th, 1964, the night before the scheduled grand jury hearing, Bonanno was kidnapped in front of his lawyer's apartment on Park Avenue.
This man said, "Come on, Joe. My boss wants to talk to you." With that, he swung Joe around, and I saw that he had a gun in his right hand.
At first, it appeared that Bonanno had in fact been murdered. Soon, however, there was speculation that Joe had staged his own kidnapping to avoid both the government and his vicious enemies in the mob.
In the classic gangster style, if you're taken for a ride, you're never seen again. Joe gets taken for a ride, he says, but he's not killed.
6 weeks later, Joe contacted Bill at a payphone saying only that he was unharmed and in hiding. The FBI searched all over the world to find Joe Bonanno. Dozens of potential witnesses were subpoenaed, including Bill Bonanno and his younger brother, Joe Jr.
When your brother made that phone call, were you glad to hear that your father was alive? No comment.
In Joe's absence, the leader of the Bonanno family insurrection, Gaspar di Gregorio, lured son Bill to a supposed peace meeting at this house in Brooklyn. When Bill arrived, Gaspar's gunman ambushed him. Shooting back and running for his life, Bill narrowly escaped. Hearing about the attempted hit on his son, a furious Joe Bonanno emerged from hiding after 18 months. He was tan and looked healthy as he showed up at the federal courthouse in New York saying, "I understand you want to speak with me." The Godfather took the Fifth Amendment, sailed through the proceedings, and then focused on retribution in his own family.
When he reappeared, it was like the second coming. First of all, no one expected him to ever reappear or be found, let alone emerge alive.
Bonanno sent word to the commission that he was still in control of his family. He claimed he had been held captive for 6 weeks by his cousin Magaddino, who was trying to intimidate him into abandoning New York. The commission made no move for fear of starting another war. Joe's reputation as a street-fighting gangster dating all the way back to 1930 now insulated him.
They ended up having enough doubt, at least, or enough fear of Joe Bonanno, depending on how you look at it, to not do what was the most obvious move, according to organized crime rules, which would be to kill him.
But in an underworld that abhors any kind of power vacuum, Joe Bonanno's withdrawal from active leadership of his family had done irreversible damage. For the next 2 years, he would fight his own men and the ambitions of the other bosses who would try and take over his family limb by limb. Godfather Joe Bonanno emerged from hiding in 1966, ready to fight and kill to save his troubled crime family. An insurrection had split the family, and now the Mafia Commission was poised to take control of the Bonannos. Though he wanted to retire, Joe would not be dictated to by the commission or anyone else. The street war, dubbed the Banana Split in the press, lasted for 2 years, a murder on one side calling for a retaliation from the other. Joe moved into the Long Island ranch house of his dutiful son Bill and daughter-in-law Rosalie. The house became Bonanno's war room and headquarters for the mob soldiers, who were still loyal to the Godfather and wanted to defend their turf. But in the spring of 1968, one of Bill Bonanno's closest associates was murdered, and it was rumored that he was next. Fearing for the safety of their families, the Godfather and his son made a fateful decision. They would retreat to the west, where far from the street war, Joe's patient wife Fay was waiting.
It gradually came to him, his consciousness, that it ain't worth it anymore.
Shortly after returning to Arizona, the 73-year-old Bonanno suffered a heart attack. Joe's cousin, Stefano Magaddino, also suffered a heart attack and faded from power. Joe had no choice but to concede defeat to the rising mafia powerhouse, Carlo Gambino, who was now the dominant force on the commission. Joe agreed to be exiled from New York. In exchange, there would be no repercussions against any Bonanno family soldiers.
Joe Bonanno, by the fact that he was banished and, lived on for years on the shelf, is the organized crime term. And it's very rare, you put a soldier on the shelf. It is very rare to put a boss on the shelf. And that's essentially what La Cosa Nostra did to Joe Bonanno.
Leaving behind his failed kingdom in 1968, Joe hoped to live out his days in peace. But for the next 10 years, the FBI attempted to break Joe Bonanno using scare tactics, spies, and wiretapping.
My father is fond of saying that he left Italy to get away from the fascists. And he came to this country and he ran smack into the Gestapo.
In his old age, Joe Bonanno felt persecuted and misunderstood. He watched from afar as his former driver and captain, Carmine Galante, was murdered by his own men. The underlings wanted control of the heroin pipeline Galante had established. In time, they too were murdered, but the lucrative drug trade only expanded. Joe winced at every reference in the media to his family name, and he lamented the loss of loyalty, restraint, and discipline in his world.
My dad told me many years ago that only a mad dog wants to hurt another human being without just cause. There is no tradition today on the streets. It's dog eat dog and hurt or be hurt.
There's this constant distinction in the mafia between the rhetoric and the reality. The rhetoric is one of loyalty and tradition and order. The reality is constant competition and new generations coming along and wanting what the bosses have.
In 1980, Joe's wife of 49 years passed away. Fay's last delirious words to Joe were, "Are they coming to get you?" Joe became despondent. At 78 years old, the aging Godfather wanted the world to know that he considered the current crop of mafiosi to be practicing a mutant form of his sacred tradition. In 1983, Bonanno announced he was doing something previously unheard of for a Godfather. He was publishing his memoirs.
The only person who can tell the story of a Joe Bonanno is Joe Bonanno.
He was the first and only one to write a book about the mob. Years ago, you did that. If you even tried to do it, you'd be murdered.
What Bonanno could not have anticipated was that an aggressive young district attorney would use his memoirs as ammunition. And Joe Bonanno, exiled by his peers 20 years earlier, would unwittingly have his revenge. In 1983, at 78 years old, Joe Bonanno's memoir about his life as a Godfather, called A Man of Honor, was published. In the book, Joe referred to himself as the last survivor of an extinct species. He wrote, "I've had to protect myself and my people, but I've never been bloodthirsty.
All my life I've been misunderstood. I just rule my family as a father.
Rudy Giuliani had just become a U.S. attorney when A Man of Honor hit the bookstores. Giuliani was on a crusade against the mafia and had nothing but contempt for Bonanno's self-serving image of a godfather living by a code of honor.
I have no romance about people involved in organized crime. They are vicious, cold-blooded killers, and some of them are worse than others. Some of them really enjoy killing.
But when Giuliani read Bonanno's book, something clicked. He realized that the Godfather's documented experience could be used as evidence that the commission existed and was responsible for half a century of murders and racketeering schemes. Unaware of Giuliani's plans, Joe Bonanno made an appearance on 60 Minutes to discuss his autobiography. He invited the camera crew to Christmas dinner at his daughter's home for a rare glimpse of his personal life.
You know why? Because I love you all.
Joe Bonanno tried to use the television appearance to show that he was not the mysterious crime figure that the media and law enforcement portrayed him to be. He was instead a man of honor.
I was the most respected man in New York and all over the country. I came from the family Bonanno, who has a great tradition in Sicily, and I came here with honor.
U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani traveled all the way to Arizona with some questions of his own for the so-called man of honor.
Thank you.
Joe refused to talk, saying that the experience would pose a serious threat to his health. The judge rejected Bonanno's medical excuse, held him in contempt of court, and put him in jail for the next year and a half, his longest stay in prison, but he would not rat on his fellow mobsters. Still, his book, A Man of Honor, helped to convict more mafiosi than ever thought possible, diminishing the power of organized crime in New York City. And yet, the family that Joe Bonanno built not only survives to this day, but is flourishing.
And the Bonanno crime family, the family that had had all the trouble over the years, they're in better shape right now than any other organized crime family in New York or probably the country.
Joe Bonanno, now 93 years old and a great-grandfather, is the only surviving godfather from the original commission created in 1931. His life encompasses nearly a century of mafia history.
Bonanno has never been touched, never an attempt made on his life, because he's an original. He's a charter member of the Mafia Commission in this country. Nobody's going to take him out.
As Joe's oldest son, Bill Bonanno has lived in the long shadow cast by his father. Yet where there might have been resentment, there is great love and acceptance of his fate.
I am not ashamed of who I am or what I am. I've accepted the life that was handed to me, and I've tried to do the best that I can.
After spending a decade in and out of jail on conspiracy charges and tax evasion, Bill eventually became a television producer, focusing on stories about his family.
My dad's philosophy was, you have a right to lead your life the way you want to lead it, as long as you are responsible for the decisions that you make and assume the consequences of those decisions.
Joe was, I think, a very successful leader. He did do a good job in keeping the families operating in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Where is the real honor in an organization where you take a sworn oath of secrecy and your official job